Thanks, Scott. And good evening, everybody. And yes, we do have those workshops. I'm excited about those starting next week. So that's a nice way to kind of interact in a real small group setting. And in my own case, with me directly. So there's a lot of room for interaction and back and forth. So they're a lot of fun. So today, as Scott mentioned, I always start with a little bit of just talking about a topic. The topic that really was screaming at me today was denial. And I'm seeing that in different places in my world lately. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about denial, because I don't think we've talked about that in a while. I usually try to focus on tools and recovery skills and kind of the flip side of these kind of things. But I think it's really kind of important to go do a little bit of a deep dive into what denial is and the nature of denial, and kind of why it's so important to talk about in the nature of addiction. So, as we know, speaking of addiction is really classified that one of the hallmarks of addiction is denial, which is this really a refusal to acknowledge or believe or see kind of the truth that starts to surround us in our addictive disorders. But denial, if we sort of start to look at it, really starts to explain why we can persist in the face of negative consequences. Because really, the only way that we can correct our behaviors as human beings is to have consequences and to understand that, if we do this, if we do X, it's going to result in Y. And denial helps us kind of, it makes that fuzzy. It disconnects the logical connection in our brain. We know it at somewhere rationally, but at a deeper level, and sometimes not, but at a deeper level, it's really quite confusing. So, and these costs, what are these costs? Jobs, our health, our marriages, our financial security, our freedom, all the costs that addictions can wreak havoc in our lives are all there. And despite that, I've seen in my own course of my own addiction too, I remember it's just one consequence after another, and just it didn't quite register. I could always explain it away. It was always something else. And the really bad stuff, I just couldn't let myself even be in touch with. I was just kind of had this like Teflon thing. It just didn't stick to me in my awareness. So those costs, as they start to accumulate, the rest of the world starts to see it very clearly. And the addict, when they're in that kind of bubble or trance that we speak of here, really just doesn't see it at all. So there's a refusal to really acknowledge the reality of the situation that increasingly everybody sees, but the addict has real struggle with inside. And so what are we trying to do? We're, as an addict on the inside, we're trying to maintain that positive view of ourselves, that to sort of ignore the bad news, pick the good news. There's different kinds of confirmation biases where we kind of cherry pick the things that we see that kind of fit our story that we're telling ourselves, but we selectively kind of ignore or don't see the rest. And this becomes very kind of complex and involved as these denial systems start to develop. But denial, can also masquerade as other things, right? It can masquerade as forgetfulness, or being distracted, or being otherwise kind of out of touch with what's happening, or a lot of blaming, a lot of deflection. This couldn't possibly be my fault. It's all your fault, or the fault of our boss, or the situation, or the economy, or anything really. In my own case, I'm an alcoholic in recovery, but boy, before I gave up alcohol, I tried to be a vegan. I tried to give up smoking. I got a cat because I needed something to love. I figured I needed to fill my time. So I went to night school and got a master's degree. Nothing worked because I didn't recognize the problem. But boy, I sure tried to fix it in every other way possible. So it's this defense mechanism. And what denial does really is it keeps us from feeling all the negative feelings and being aware of all the negative stuff that's happening to us as a result of our addiction. And, addicts notoriously avoid pain. In fact, we know that, the addiction is not about the great feelings we get, the highs from porn or sex or cocaine or alcohol. It may have started that way when the first dopamine things, but eventually we learn to use this tremendous manipulation of our brain chemistry in order to avoid feeling bad. and after a while to numb. And then that's really the primary purpose of addiction, is to disconnect. Emotional numbing. So it's an emotional painkiller. And I know from years of working with methamphetamine users that meth is like the ultimate painkiller. But guess what? Sex and porn are right up there with the amount of dopamine they release, and equally powerful in terms of just that need to kill off the pain that not only are we bringing to the addiction to start with, but the addiction itself causes a lot of pain as those consequences start to mount. And we're not there. Other things, the shame, and I'm talking now about how we can kind of disconnect through our addiction from these consequences of the addiction itself. So it's shame about what we've done, the low self-esteem, the repeated failures, the drawing a line in the sand, saying, well, I'll never do that. And then we do that. And then we draw another line in the sand and cross that one as well. And so this kind of downward spiral that we see as we continue to numb ourselves from what's going on is really starting to be frightening. Now, there is another really interesting thing. The more we've gotten to know about brain science and neuroplasticity, we also know now that denial is not just about this kind of psychological defense and disconnect, but there's also a little bit of kind of brain fuzziness that's happened. We know that the more the addictive disorder strengthens, that midbrain section where the addiction kind of has its roots starts to take over, and the connections with our neocortex, the frontal cortex, which is the adult in the room, right? That's the impulse control. That's the prediction of bad outcomes. That's the ability to look into the future a little bit and say, whoa, that wouldn't work out so well. I better not do that. The ability to resist those impulses, though, it kind of gets very weak and offline. And so that lack of impulse control, the negativity that goes with that space, the escalation of denial, all adds up to real trouble for the addict. And so the other thing I'll just say, because I'm starting to talk a lot about this, I'm passionate about this tonight. One other thing, as we're weighing, we're talking about impulse control. What happens is that the impulses to use or to act out are so strong. And these are, I call them, I equate them to little landmines in our brains that once they get activated, boom, they blow up, and they're there and three-dimensional and alive, like kind of white phosphorus burning hot. And we don't have the brain power to resist those once they get started. And so it's this really a kind of nasty, negative downward cycle that really gets complicated. So what do we need? Really, the very first step, and if we look at literally the first steps of the 12 steps, it's all about surrender and acceptance and breaking through denial. And how do we break through denial? What do we have to do? A lot of it is just really being teachable. And when we look at the addictive cycle, there's usually phases of that. Typically, after we act out, when there's that shame and remorse phase, when people are a little bit teachable, they're hurting, they're a little bit aware of the consequences they've created. The denial system is a little bit weak at that point, and there's a little bit of a crack into this world that they can start to see the reality. And those are the moments that we really have to strike, both as addicts and as professionals, to really help people see and to really point out the discrepancies in the story that, addicts come in, for example, to our treatment centers and every treatment center with this really tight little perfect story of why they do what they do. And there's not really much room to look for discrepancies of, well, why do you do this if you say you're doing that? And kind of to pick that apart, which really starts to kind of, after a while, if you can get enough of those cracks in this denial system, the whole thing starts to collapse and the reality kind of crashes in. And by the way, at that point, we have to remember that what are we using addiction for? We're using addiction as a painkiller. We're using addiction to numb. And so it's very critical in that crisis point when the addictive the denial system and the addiction kind of breaks apart, it collapses a little bit. We need to make sure we have skills, both as addicts and professionals, skills to help the addict pick up those pieces. How can they regulate their emotions? How can they use breathing? How can they use the signs and clues their body's giving them about what's actually going on in their body? So there's lots of ways to do that with those new tools, but that's really an important piece. We can't just let the newly recovering addict kind of hang there in the wind without giving them new tools. So that's my kind of quick snapshot of denial. It's a critical thing. And by the way, I've talked about denial in the early phases of of the addiction, denial can creep in anytime. I think I'm many years in recovery, knock on wood, and I have no doubt that in the right set of circumstances, I could start to get some denial about where I'm at or what I'm doing as well. So that's why we talk about connection and the importance of being in meetings and getting accountability partners and just having people know where we're at and can call us on it when we need to be called on it. So I think with that, I'll stop. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, David. Everybody type your questions into the Q&A. I have a couple guys here from my support and accountability group on Monday night, and one of them has already asked a question, and the other one is supposed to, and I would ask it myself, but I can't remember what it is. So you're going to have to type it into the Q&A. But as far as denial, this is one of my favorite topics too. I'm a big believer that denial, it starts inside, and then after I believe it, then it starts coming out of my mouth and I expect you to believe it. It's just this series of lies that I tell myself to justify and minimize and rationalize behavior that some sane part of me, the prefrontal cortex, knows is a real problem. So I just throw lies at that, and if I scream them loud enough and often enough, it's kind of like politics today. If I scream it loud enough and often enough, then it must be true, right? And that's kind of how my brain worked in my addiction. I just started to believe my own crap. And then I started expecting other people to believe my crap. And, I look at denial now with some, distance, and it's the kind of thing where other people can look at you and go, oh my God, you have a serious problem. But you can say, oh no, if somebody else was doing this, it would be a serious problem, but it's okay for me because, and then I have 27 reasons why it's okay for me. That's my denial. If you were doing this, you would be crazy, but I'm not crazy because, and I just have, I remember being in treatment 21 years ago now for my sex addiction. And I was just so deep in denial that they made me write out a list of all of the justifications I had, like why my behavior is okay. And so it was like 2 pages long. And then they made me read it out loud in group. And as I heard the words coming out of my mouth and saw the people looking at me, I just thought, oh boy, that way it was such a reality check. I was like, and I was just mortified hearing myself read off these things that until that moment had made perfect sense. But out loud in the presence of other people, I was like, oh, I have a real problem here. And I have done everything. I love that you talked about, going vegan. That's a new one for me. Somebody goes vegan to fix their addiction. I went to therapy for depression. I went to therapy for anxiety. I went on exercise regimens. You name it, I tried it, to avoid dealing with the real problem. And I think that's fairly common. I can't tell you how many people I know who went to therapy and never talked about their addiction. Never talked about alcohol, never talked about drugs, never talked about sex, never talked about any of it.
Right.
And are therapists trained now to ask these questions and to kind of dig below the surface, or is it still the same? I mean, 20 years ago, they weren't trained to ask these questions.
I think if you, as a therapist, seek out specialty training with addictions, then of course you are, yeah. But the standard therapeutic curriculum does not have it. Addiction was an elective when I got my degree, and so I think a lot of people, they're interested in trauma or depression or anxiety, and they're not really looking for addiction, and they believe what the addict, the well-polished addict, is telling them. And that I've said, we have, well, I can't tell you how many clients I've had either in my own practice or come to Seeking Integrity who have kind of been, I think, disserved, is that a word? Misserved, not served well by a therapist who just didn't pick up on stuff that, totally missed the boat. And so, no, I wouldn't count on just the therapist to pick it up. And also, by the way, as a therapist, I will say, what a tremendous waste of time and money to have clients come and basically lie in session. Why? To make themselves feel good? I'm just like, I'm not a mind reader. I'm pretty good, but come on, why even bother? Usually it's, I think, maybe to please somebody and say to their wives or husbands that, look, I'm making these efforts and see I'm okay. But that's denial too. So it's a complicated scenario.
Yeah, I threw thousands of dollars at the wrong problem, or the wrong problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
And interestingly, the problems I was getting help with mostly went away when I got clean and sober. They didn't entirely go away. I still have some depression and some anxiety, but nothing like I was dealing with
Right.
in my addiction. So,
Exactly.
okay. Type questions into the Q&A. We've got a smallish group tonight, less than we usually have. So pump your questions in, and we'll try to get to them. This is about de-escalation tools for relational conflict. When I feel anger coming on, I know I should de-escalate, but what tools do I have to self-de-escalate? So I know who asked this question, and this is a relationship where, he gets accused of something that's not accurate and he wants to defend himself, and it goes boom. And how do we de-escalate, or any situation, but I know that's
right.
What this one is.
Yeah, so this is a really typical scenario that we see, because especially anger, but any kind of heated issue, and especially in a relationship where usually the couple they're well practiced in escalating really quickly, so it can go from A, B, C to Z. Just they skip over all the middle part and go right to the heat of the anger, because they've danced that dance so many times before. And so I think it's really important, first of all, to have an awareness that it's coming. I see here somebody says, I feel oncoming anger. I know I should de-escalate, but what tools do I have? This is a really critical piece, because part of it, when we get into that rush of anger, especially, it's a real mood changer. And there's a lot of adrenaline and stress hormones, and there's a little bit of, for an intensity addict, and that would be an amphetamine person, a sex and porn addict, gambling, all that stuff on the intensity side of the addictions. This is a real rush. And so there's something very seductive about just getting to the anger. And the word that I think captures it perfectly for me, when I feel that kind of heat, is righteous indignation. It's like, I am right. I've been falsely accused, and how dare you? And, and we get all puffy and go to it. That's a really dangerous thing, because these mood changers, once we, it's like an amphetamine addict taking, Adderall a little bit. We're feeding our body a little taste of that rush, and I think it opens up the doorway to all kinds of other stuff. So the awareness that it's coming, and then the ability to resist it, and to say, no, let's stay calm and avoid opening that door. Now, the problem with a lot of addicts is that we don't have much insight. We don't even have much warning that it's coming. Suddenly we are in the reaction. And I think that just comes with practice, and really starting to read all the signs and to know what's happening, and then having the willingness to do something about it, and not just go down the same path. If we go into these reactive modes without intervening on ourselves, we will react, right? So it really requires an intervention on ourselves to take a break. And what we're trying to do is put in any kind of circuit breaker into that process. And by that, I mean any distance. So the classic kind of timeout, right? Just like, whoa, this is getting too hot. I need to take a walk outside for 10 minutes. Well, let's come back. And by the way, we don't because addicts also, because we avoid, it's really easy to kind of just say, walk away and never come back to it. And so I think it's important, if you say, I need a timeout, I need 10 minutes to walk around the block, we'll come back and we will finish this. So you're going to show up again. You're not bailing. But I think that willingness to observe it and then to interrupt it. Now, one of the things I think is really important to be able to read our bodies, because oftentimes our bodies are going to give us a little clue about what's happening a few milliseconds before our brain does. And so really every little millisecond counts in this, because we don't want to drop into that reaction before we have a chance to intervene. And so I think to really know your body, be aware of what's happening in your stomach, what's happening in your throat, as your face starting to flush, you're getting tense. what's happening, because those are really important signs that we need to pay attention to and then intervene. Because of this, a lot of this, it's almost like a physical buildup. It's like locomotive that's starting to build up speed going down the tracks. I think it's really important to have some tools to intervene on those physical symptoms. And for that, I use a lot of breathing and breath work. And I think that is a really effective way to intervene. And again, if we're going for those circuit breakers, the 4-7-8 breathing, for example, is one that we've talked about here many times, where you inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. And in any breathing sequence, by the way, the longer the exhale, the better, right? The exhale should be a longer period of time than the inhale or the hold. And that will help start to relax and break. The other thing too is to have, we talk about addiction and recovery being all about connection, to really have people you can call on to bring us back to normal. If I'm having a partner, if I'm having a big fight with my partner, chances are my partner is not the one who can really help de-escalate me at that moment. I need to get hold of a recovery person that knows me, that can kind of talk some sense into me, that can kind of talk me off the ledge, or to talk some sense, or whatever I need to hear to be accountable at that moment. So I think having those ready lists that we've talked about, and Scott and I are both old school with, we used to have, I think, old written typed lists in our wallets, and now we have phones that can do that. But whatever, we need ready access to phone numbers and to be able to use them. But so whatever it takes, I think that kind of circuit breaker approach is really important. A timeout, a breather, agreeing to come back to this thing 15 minutes later when everybody's calmed down, doing some breath work, counting to 10. I mean, whatever it takes to kind of interrupt that process. And what you're doing, you're buying time to allow yourself to kind of get back in your reasonable mindset and approach things in a different way. The other thing too is that if you have time, I think sometimes reflecting is really important. So what is just happening? How is this dynamic? If we're having an argument, how is this argument familiar to me, and when does this happen before? And very often, because of the trauma that's associated with addiction, if I'm having a problem with my partner, it may be that my partner reminds me of my father or somebody else, and I'm reacting in a way that I would have reacted 40 years ago. So all that is to bring into account too. But I think the main objective, to boil it all down, is to really get a sense of interrupting the process, not letting it just build, and really having the fortitude, I think, to intervene when we probably really want to react, but making the choice not to. That self-awareness and that self-control, which is something addicts don't always have in the beginning, but it does get better. I think that's really important to exercise in those moments. Scott, you're muted.
Thank you. In my Monday group, we were obviously talking about de-escalating. This is the question that I was fishing for earlier. This is somebody who had a triggering work experience, with a customer at work, and 2 days later, it was the weekend, and was washing the car and was still fuming and playing it back, and I should have said, that kind of thing. And he writes here, I know I'm supposed to reach out to my support group, but during these moments, oftentimes I'm just not thinking straight or calmly enough to do so. I just want to think rationally again. And I think you kind of talked about the de-escalating techniques here. And I'm going to ask you about a couple more in just a second, but how common is it for particularly addicts to just take one thing and turn a molehill into a mountain,
I think it's kind of a way of life. We do that very regularly, and we're very good at it. And I think I didn't mention this word before, but there's another word I think that could characterize the life of an addict, and that's being a victim, right? We easily drop into that victim role, and where we collect, insults. We are aggrieved. We have people that have treated us badly and don't respect us or don't understand us and don't give us credit for what we've done, and all that stuff that we can start to kind of have a real anger about. And really, I think that's where we get into the idea of a resentment, which is that, resentment literally means feeling again and again and again, feeling over and over again. And that's what that is. And hang on to a feeling. Typically, anger is the most common one, probably. Hurt too, I think, to some extent. Shame, we can get into. There's several kind of all-star hits for addicts in terms of emotions. But I think we can really drop into that and then and hang on to it, because that gives us fuel. I talked about the rush that happens with kind of rage and anger and righteous indignation. There is something that's very activating and intense about having a resentment like that we can kind of go over and replay, and we're kind of getting off on it, if you will, and in terms of a mood changing experience. And it's very dangerous because that undermines our rationality, it undermines our insight, and it undermines our willingness to do the right thing. Eventually, that really increases the likelihood of acting out when we hang on, when we savor those insults that people have thrown at us, and how misunderstood we are. It's bad territory.
And then the other thing I think we do is we just start to think we deserve exactly what we just got. It's our shame takes over, and I think can be the same kind of, not necessarily a rush, but it can occupy our thoughts so much that it's almost like the addiction.
Right. Shame is a consuming experience, right? And we talk about that shame spiral that people go into, where it's just they drop into this, and it's a kind of a little bit of a reverse narcissism. I think it's like, oh, I'm the worst person in the world. I'm so terrible. I'm all this and I'm that. And again, it's a distorted view of reality, and it's one where we don't have responsibility. Other people have done this to us, and that's not a healthy place for an addict to be in.
Yeah. Does doing a 10th step help?
Oh,
and maybe,
yeah.
Maybe you could explain what a 10th step is for those who don't know.
Yeah. So I think the steps are designed so that once we go through them, for initially at least, then the last three are these so-called maintenance steps. So the 10th step is really like a review. Many people do it at the end of the day. Our clients do it as part of their kind of closeout for the day. But it's to really evaluate how did my day go? What could I have done better? What did I do well? What did I not do so well? How did my behavior impact on this person? Or what do I need to make an amends? Do I need to set something right? And it's a great way of just cleaning up our messes before they get too big and overbearing. So yeah, absolutely. I think this is where, again, the steps in their wisdom have a lot of tools built in. And the 10th step is one that really functions very well to it's like a maintaining our kind of healthy approach and keeping these things from building up too much.
Yeah. Just from the shame angle, the 10th step helps me in my world. It helps me understand what is my role in whatever it is I'm upset about, and what is not my role in whatever it is I'm upset about, because sometimes I was just in the way. Sometimes I don't owe an amends, but I can still be upset because somebody else owes me an amends or whatever. So, okay.
Right. But just even sorting that out, because I think when we're in denial or when we're in our addiction, just even understanding those dynamics of our role in it or not is a really important distinction to make, and to have that insight is huge.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll just speak for myself. I have to reach out to my fellows in recovery and say, okay, here's the situation. I can't wrap my head around it. Help me out.
Right, exactly.
But it's picking up the phone and doing that is often the hardest part of that process. Okay, next question. I found it interesting when you said denial can be found in the form of forgetfulness and disconnection. My wife often points out when I am being both as a red flag and says I should be paying attention to it. I've always connected it to being stressed or busy, never to denial. Could you please expand on that? Great question.
Okay, good. And so I'm really glad you found that helpful, because I think, yeah, denial, like shame, can kind of hide out in different ways. It has different body postures and facial expressions, but also attitudes. I think sometimes we may not be consciously kind of keeping a thought at bay, but we can start to kind of forget the insight. We can forget that we said we would do something, right? That kind of forgetfulness that kind of takes well, first of all, it interferes with our accountability, right? If we forgot to do something, or if it kind of gets fuzzy about what our responsibilities are, get murky or blurry, that's a way of kind of avoiding the consequences, or avoiding making a connection, or avoiding the reality of what we might be doing. So that forgetting, the disconnecting. And remember that addicts, almost by definition, step into this bubble or trance. We step out of our lives into this kind of dissociated state. And when we're in there, that's when we kind of start to lose empathy for the impact we're having on people we love, and the impact of what we're going to do. And that we lose our ability to discern, I want this now. I know it's going to have terrible consequences tomorrow, but I don't care about tomorrow. I want it now. Like that kind of warped decision-making stuff. But all those are kind of flavors of denial. And I think it's really something to pay attention to, because it masquerades in these kind of little different forms that I think all add up to this kind of disconnect from, it's a way of protecting us from the consequences of our behavior and our actions. And the more we can make those clean lines, the better off we'll be, and the more awareness we'll have about our own recovery too. But I think that's to expand that a little bit. And denial isn't just about kind of being clueless or unaware of what we're doing. I think that a lot of times there is a lot of awareness and a good degree of manipulation too. And so I think sometimes people can hide behind denial in a weird kind of way to avoid some of the consequences. And some of that, I think, looks like forgetfulness or disconnecting from patterns, or kind of a blissful ignorance about what we're doing and why.
And I'm reading this second to last sentence. I've always connected my forgetfulness and disconnection to being stressed or busy, never to denial. It's funny how addicts are always stressed and busy, and we forget things. And I know I used to, forget things or cancel things at the last minute because I was stressed and busy. But really, I just wanted to go act out or get drunk, or but as far as anybody else knew, I was stressed or busy,
Right.
And I always see addiction as a form of denial. Addiction itself is about denying reality in general, whereas denial is about denying reality of the addiction. So it's just an extra layer.
It's true. That's exactly true. That's right. That's right.
It's no surprise that these two, travel hand in hand.
And just, the idea of stress, right? The life of an addict is very stressful, but a lot of that it's of our own making, right? And it's the consequence of what we do and the decisions we make.
Who did I tell what lie to? Who knows what lie? Just remembering that is stressful.
Right. I always tell my clients, in recovery, you're going to have a whole lot of open energy and time that used to be filled with taking care of your addiction, or recovering from the addiction, or planning for the addiction, or all that space that it occupied as a central star in our lives. That thank God recovery opens that up. And there's other kinds of stresses. But then honestly, life probably these days is stressful for everybody. But at least in recovery, it's kind of more reality oriented stresses. It's real stresses, as opposed to kind of all the stuff that my addiction throws off in terms of the chaos, the chaos and the craziness, and the drama that goes with an active addiction is exhausting. And I think that's something we could all lose easily.
I love this next question. Hi, David. Thanks for all you do. I'm 6 months clean today from meth. Congratulations. Which I've struggled with for almost 20 years, and you're still alive. I'm impressed. I turned 40 in a few months, and it's clear to me that I've never known how to connect sex with love. I came of age sexually in the old AOL chat rooms. The internet and online hookup culture taught me from the very beginning that sex was hot if it was random and new. Of course, meth only turbocharged all of that. Each of my relationships failed because inevitably, once the newness wore off and I began to love the person like family, I no longer found them sexually attractive. Do you have any advice for untangling some of these patterns? Thank you. There's a lot in that.
There's a lot in that, but boy, just the way you framed the question shows an awful lot of insight. So this is really impressive to me. And first of all, I echo Scott. Congratulations. That's a long meth career, and 6 months is no small feat for that. So So good for you. I think this is the classic problem. And I think when I was doing my book, Lust, Man, and Meth, the subtitle, my original subtitle was Reclaiming, something like Reclaiming Healthy Sex and Intimacy. And I realized for most addicts, there was no reclaiming. And me too. I didn't know how to do that. No, but addicts don't know how to do sex and intimacy. I think it's all kind of, it's more confused with intensity. And I think that's one of the concepts we talk about with our clients is confusing intensity for intimacy, right? And that idea for novelty. That's a dopamine driven function. Addiction requires novelty. You know, look at the escalation that happens with pornography or with sexual acting out or with even injecting drugs after smoking no longer gives you the hit. It's all about escalation intensity. And the same thing goes with sex. And we learn to associate the sex with the excitement, the randomness, the risk, the intensity of it. And the nature and skills that go into an ongoing relationship are a totally different world from all that. And I think the challenge for addicts in recovery, especially chemsex addicts or sex or porn addicts, is learning how to have kind of healthy, meaningful sex, and how to do that. And that requires unpacking a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of baggage that we've carried with us our whole lives, from some of the attachment issues and the attachment wounds that kids experience in early on, to body image, to core beliefs about ourselves, being worthy of love, being worthy of intimacy, being having body shame. I mean, there's a ton of issues that without the addiction present, suddenly they're there. And so sex and intimacy in recovery is a huge challenge for people, because for the first time, most of us are dealing with it without some kind of mood altering chemical or behavior on board that kind of softens it or disinhibits us or escalates it, or it's all very real. And I think that's really challenging for a lot of people. So I think what we have to do is really move from this idea of novelty and into other forms of appeal. So with chemsex and porn addiction and sex addiction, our sexual arousal templates start to be dominated by the features, by fantasies and erotic images that are directly related to our addiction. And those, as you say, you really pointed out, very often the result of that is that we start to lose any kind of erotic attraction or appeal to people we have an emotional connection with, because they're around, we care about them, we care about making a mistake, being vulnerable, not living up to their needs, whatever fears we may carry into that relationship. Whereas if with a hookup, it's anonymous, who cares, right? It's all kind of, it doesn't have the risk of emotional vulnerability that intimacy has. Now, it has other kinds of risk, and that's part of the thrill of that kind of behavior. But I think so, to really look at this requires unpacking a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm sorry to talk about this so long, but I think to really look at what is healthy sex for you. You know, what is intimacy like? What are your barriers to intimacy? What are your core beliefs? The core beliefs are those I statements. I'm and many addicts have many negative core beliefs. You know, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm unsafe, I'm damaged goods. You know, all those really toxic beliefs that we have to actively work to change before we can start to make that connection. And by the way, and I'll wrap it up with this, what I think is the effective strategy for creating a healthy relationship with another person is to first start by creating a healthy relationship with ourselves. I think we have to get to know ourselves, and including uncovering those core beliefs, changing them, doing work, resolving old trauma, all that stuff that we have to do, and really starting to love that part of ourselves. And I use the inner child, do a lot of inner child work and internal IFS kind of parts stuff. And I think a lot of men particularly kind of roll their eyes, like talking to their little inner boy, but that is the part of us where the addiction is emanating from. That wounded part of ourselves needs us, and needs our attention, needs our love, and needs our support and our protection, and needs to be heard. And until we pay attention to that part of us, I think we're not going to go very far. So there's a lot of work to be done. I just want to close by saying it's really totally possible. When I encourage people, and speaking now to you as a meth user, especially, I think a lot of people have this kind of hopelessness about ever being able to establish a relationship. And by the way, not everybody wants a relationship. And I'm talking about people that really aspire to that. I've also had a lot of clients who really want to have a relationship, but they're stuck in this routine of, one night stands and hookups, and that's not probably the best avenue toward a meaningful relationship. But it takes just work and showing up and steadiness. So hang in there, and watch from our workshops, because we Seek Integrity. We're talking. Scott mentioned a lot of the sex addiction stuff. I'm doing a chemsex. We're also going to start rolling out, hopefully, some kind of sex and intimacy based workshops that aren't necessarily so addiction driven, but overall just sex, because most people don't know some of the common stuff that say, I'm a sex therapist. I've had a lot of training and different kinds of attachment styles and intimacy and sexual models and all that stuff that is useful, I think, for people to know, especially if they're starting to navigate, trying to create healthy bonds post-addiction. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to remind people of your chemsex workshop starting next week on Monday. You're going to talk about all this stuff in detail.
Right.
Anybody who struggles with substances and sex together, sign up.
We have a whole section called Untangling Meth, Sex, and Intimacy. So it's all, this is right up that alley. So good.
I am a betrayed partner of 3 years. My sex addict partner is an addiction counselor for drugs and alcohol. I heard this is common. I'm quite frustrated that he knows the steps and the triggers, but he isn't working on his own addiction. Any suggestions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I can really.
Denial question.
Yeah, it's a denial question for sure. I really understand your frustration because, and I see this. And by the way, healthcare professionals and addiction professionals are at really high risk for addictive disorders. And so having that knowledge doesn't necessarily guarantee insight or willingness into one's own behavior. So I understand your frustration with it. And that this is someone who should know. But again, when we're talking about denial, where we sort of disconnect from reality-based thinking, and we can start to compartmentalize. I didn't mention that word tonight either, but addicts are master compartmentalizers. I can have my public life here with you nice folks, and then have this whole other life that nobody knows about that I'm very comfortable switching back and forth with, or lives, by the way. We have addicts can have many compartments in their lives, and no one knows the whole story typically for an active addict. So it's possible for me to sit here in denial and be an alcohol and drug counselor and be totally out of control with sex and porn, but that's my secret life that's kind of compartmentalized. And for a while, at least, I think I can kind of rationalize that and balance that through the gift of denial, by keeping me unaware of the incongruence or the discrepancy of those two things, and it doesn't make sense, and it's maddening for people that are out there. So I guess what I'm saying here is that even if we're trained as addiction professionals, it doesn't really give us an advantage in terms of helping us break through our own denial. That has to be done usually with peers, and I would say, for frustrated partners, you can point stuff out, but I think really the powerful breakthrough of denial, where people can really get in somebody's face if necessary, but really confront, with love, the discrepancies, or basically just saying, you're full of crap. This is what I'm seeing, and that's harder to hear from a partner for whatever reason than it is maybe from a counselor or from peers. But I would suggest this person get into position with therapy or with a group where he can start to be called out on some of the discrepancies that are clearly here in his life.
Yeah, we also do just one-on-one consult sessions for 30 minutes or an hour. If you can get him to set up one of those with one of the staff members here at Seeking Integrity, we'll be happy to talk to him and find out what's going on and try our hand at it. But yeah, probably somebody he knows who sees what's going on is. But yeah. Next question. I tend to have the urge to act out more from chronic sustained stress or disconnection from my partner, less so from acute events. Any advice? I just want to jump in real quick and say, I handle acute events really well. It's the longer term, smaller stuff that I struggle with. I'm with you all the way. David, help.
Well, I think this is a really great observation because I always say, in in um, in a fire, in an earthquake, in a disaster, I want some addicts around me because I think basically they often kind of react very well in that moment if they're together. But it's and so to your point, I think it's a generally true observation that people tend to uh, be present. They can sustain that sort of awareness and consistency for an acute situation, but over the long haul, that's where it gets much harder to deal with. And so long haul meaning stress, chronic stress, a health condition, all those situations, relationship stress, work stress, all those are much harder to manage because it's not easily resolved, it's not quickly resolved, and it messes with our all the stuff we were talking about earlier, our victimhood and our resentments and our anger and our blaming and all that stuff. It just plays with all that. And so I think those kind of acute situations are much harder to deal with. I think we are overall much better in a crisis than we are. And so I think that's a generally true statement, whether you're a drug addict or a sex addict, by the way. I think it's all the same. And so, there's a lot of work out there and a lot of resources in terms of how to deal with chronic stress. We've talked about those in some of our webinars here. There are really great tools for that. And so, as I mentioned before, addiction is all about numbing our discomfort from life. And so, if we're in recovery, suddenly we don't have that addictive, soft, snuggly blanket to crawl into and escape from things. We're feeling stuff and we're feeling stress, and it's really incumbent on us to know how to deal with that because addiction, at least what I told myself when I got in recovery, addiction was no longer an option. I couldn't do that. I just needed to develop the tools, which at that point I didn't have any of. But I think that there's a lot of help out there for those. So I'd much rather deal with chronic stress than an active addiction. I'll tell you that.
This next one's another question that I really identify with. I have a lot of resentment and anger from the past, social and experiences that I play over and over and over in my mind. Some of these are from many years ago, 30 years or more. Is there a diagnosis for this? And what can I do about it?
Right. And so there's a couple of things. If I were your therapist, I'd be kind of looking at ruling out other stuff. So sometimes people can get a little bit obsessive. There's a higher co-occurring rate of OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder with addictive disorders. And so that can feed this tendency, right? It's harder for an obsessive person to let go of stuff. And so that might be going on here. There might be different kinds of SSRI medications. The antidepressants can sometimes help some of that if that's what it is. I wouldn't go to the medication right off the bat. I'd get some help on ruling that out. But if that's something that might be there, but I think the obsessive piece aside, and other kinds of psychological issues aside, these are kind of personality disorders and stuff where people are more labile or emotionally up and down. I think it's probably useful to kind of think about this as more habitual patterns of thinking. That's at least most of the addicts I've worked with when they get in these like lifelong resentments and where they're just kind of spun it around. It's just kind of the way they've been doing things for so long. It's really hard to break the habit. And so I think this is a case where cognitive behavioral stuff is really useful. I would also really like what's called DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. It's a set of it's basically skill sets that was created for work with borderline personalities, but it also is really effective for addiction. And it's just really everything from mindfulness to decision-making to controlling emotions. And it's very skill-based. And I think those are also ways of doing it because I guess long story short, I guess therapy, I'm thinking all kinds of therapeutic approaches I would use with you if you were my therapist. The other thing I'd mention that sometimes keeps these long-term resentments alive are what we call cognitive distortions or cognitive errors, which are black and white thinking, jumping to conclusions, overgeneralizing, catastrophizing, all that stuff where we take an event or an idea and we kind of filter it through a lens, and the lens is, when say catastrophizing, if say something might happen, I have a flat tire. Okay, that's an event. But if I catastrophize, then it's like, my God, I can take that and really run with it about how awful it is and how it's going to ruin my day and ruin my life and blah, blah, blah. So I think starting to understand some of those cognitive errors and how we typically view things that are happening to us can really be helpful. And then also just really letting go. I like a lot of releasing kind of techniques for those kind of resentments, especially that are so kind of ingrained. It's almost like a way of life at that point. Things like journaling, writing and burning. Write a letter to that person from 30 years ago, not to be mailed, but to write a letter and burn it, or take something. I have clients make a little medicine bundle sometimes and tie them to a balloon and let it float away. Or, I live near the ocean. They have clients go down to the beach and do something in the water to kind of release and purify. Just little rituals like that can sometimes be very helpful to kind of externalize these inner things, these inner thoughts that are kind of caught up in our brains that we just need to kind of put an end to. There's a great book too, called Atomic Habits by James Cleary that talks about some of these habit forming things and how to change them, with really practical tips. And I want to give a shout out to my friend Leo, who turned me onto that book. So anyway, there's some techniques and tools for you.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more technique. This is sort of the common AA technique. When you're carrying around a resentment, they tell you to pray for the person to have everything, that you would want in life: good health, good job, happy relationships. To do that twice a day, morning and evening, for 30 days. And I have done that with numerous resentments. 2019 was my year of releasing my 40-year-old resentments, the ones I still had from middle school. They're over nothing, but I was still resentful and would take them out and play with them, like Gollum with the ring, my precious. And I had to let go of them. And I got resentful about having to pray away the resentments. But then once I got over that, the resentments really went away and they have not come back. It was just, I don't know if that's the combination. I think it's a combination of CBT and DBT to do something like that, to just kind of break the habit. Yeah.
That's a really great technique too, Scott. That's like a central technique too. And I thank you for bringing that up, because I missed that one. And you're right. That idea of praying for somebody is really huge. And the gratitude idea too. It's the same notion of kind of detoxifying those thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to shorten this question. This is a family member of a sex addict who's been a sex addict for a long time, isn't doing much about it, and has a new partner after a new partner after a new partner, and they're all just traumatized because he's a sex addict. The question is, at what point does the family have responsibility to alert new people that are brought on the scene?
New relationships, you mean?
Yeah, so the addict is continually having new relationships and traumatizing new partner after new partner after new partner. So should the family intervene and warn people, or
Yikes, I don't know. I can see where we start to see a pattern and point it out. I guess if that would come about in some kind of way that wasn't too stilted or awkward, I guess it might be useful. I think that, I don't know, I'm a little hesitant to say go for it on that. I'm not sure what my hesitation is there, because it's probably a pattern that's long standing. But I think, I think without getting too involved, maybe pointing out patterns. I don't know. I'm a little uncomfortable recommending going too much farther on that. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out the source of my discomfort on that. Scott, any thoughts on that? Let me think about that if you say a few words.
I have the same discomfort, and I'm maybe it'll come to us and we'll talk about it next week, because I can't pinpoint it either, but I have the same discomfort. It's a little too enmeshed or something, and there's a boundary issue there somewhere that I'm just getting outside my hula hoop if I start telling you, oh, by the way,
Yeah, I think in that situation, I'd really err on the side of caution and get a lot of input and feedback on that. Yeah, yeah, it's a boundary thing for sure.
Yeah. Hello, David. Thank you for all your work. Can you explain the concept of dry drunk in recovery? And then they ask, is moving from a dry drunk stage to engaging life a natural progression if we retain abstinence?
So I guess my definition of a dry drunk is where we have these attitudes that are kind of carryovers from our old addictive way of life, right? And denial is one of those. We've been talking about one of those tonight, but these kind of behaviors, attitudes, assumptions, kind of the rules of engagement that we had in our addictive disorder lives. And I think that those can take over, and to me, a dry drunk is a real warning sign, basically, that things, whatever I'm doing isn't adequate and it's not quite right. And my coping mechanism and skills are being challenged by whatever the circumstances are that are external. And so the dry drunk is really a warning to me. So I think speaking as a therapist, a dry drunk is really like a little golden nugget of opportunity to see, okay, what's going on here? What have we just stumbled upon that is kind of a challenge to your recovery in this particular time and place? And how can we learn it and learn from it and correct it and maybe progress forward? Because these are stumbling blocks. And I think we all hit barriers. In a way, it's kind of, recovery is kind of like walking, in a lake or the ocean, where you can, like, you come across rocks and you stub your toe and suddenly it drops off and you hit a point where the sand gets deep and you never quite know what's under the surface. And so as we walk through recovery, I think we start to have these little events and we have to figure them out as we go. And I think a dry drunk is a really huge indicator of something like that needs some work. The progression, I think, does happen if we just, and this is where it comes down to a day at a time. And for me, it was one of those things where I could look back and say, oh, I've come a long way. It wasn't so much a day-to-day awareness, although I was eventually had that too. But for me, at least in the beginning, it was like doing the steps I needed to do, just keeping my nose clean, doing what I had to do, not really focused on the big picture so much as getting through the day. And suddenly things were different. And so I know it can happen. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of agree and also kind of disagree with you on that last one. Is moving from dry drunk to recovery basically a natural thing as long as we stay sober? And I'm going to say no. I've seen people with 30, 40 years of sobriety who are just as big an asshole today as they were they were drinking.
That's true.
The natural progression is that eventually we go to enough meetings and we come to enough things like this and things start to sink in and we start to make changes. We work the 12 steps, we go to therapy. That's the natural progression. And yes, we do move from dry drunk into, there's a line in an Avett Brothers song. It says, I've seen the program turn or make men out of monsters. And I have seen the program make men out of monsters, case in point. But we have to do the work.
Yeah.
And it is a natural progression if we do the work. And like David, I woke up one day and thought, wow, I am very different than I was a while ago.
Right.
So yeah, but yeah, just showing up and growling at people is not going to make it happen. Dry drunks can stay dry drunks for a very long time.
Yeah, and I think we both shared experiences of people we know with many years who are angry or big assholes, like you said. Yeah, they're out there. They're out there.
It's just really unpleasant. Like, man, you've been sober for 40 years. You should go drink. Maybe you'd be nicer.
Yeah.
I never say that out loud, except for just then. But I have thought it once or twice. So we're out of time, everybody. Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Please come back next week, bring the questions, and we'll get to them. I will get this posted first thing in the morning. So anybody who wants to revisit it can.
And one more time, if you're interested in a meth workshop 4 times starting Monday, check it out at seekintegrity.com.
Yep. And highly recommended. David is awesome. So, all right. Good night, all.
Thank you. Take care, Scott. Good night.